I personally want to thank Majid for that wonderful ab workout. It was hilarious. I speak tonight really as a daughter of this nation. My great uncle, somewhere up there, great something, actually wrote the music to the national anthem, I found out a while ago. I love this nation. I love the fact that Canada has such diversity. I love that our charter has in it embedded, the right to freedom of speech, the right to assembly like we are assembling tonight. I think there's so many things that are so stunningly gorgeous about our nation and that we need to fight to keep that way. I've had the privilege of being an activist and leading young adults, and some of us are getting a little bit older, in meeting with members of parliament, senators, our prime minister a few times, to dialogue with them about many different issues, be it issues like human trafficking, raising the age of sexual consent, the growing problem of abortion harassment against women, the issues of poverty, First Nations issues, and issues surrounding the Middle East as well. And one thing that I've observed in humanity is I actually think that most people, no matter what side of whatever issue it is that we're talking about, most people are actually driven by compassion. I believe most people want to defend the weak, want to defend the oppressed, want to make a stand, take a stand. I believe that most of us have a good heart. But if our foundation of information is faulty, we can find ourselves venturing into fighting for things that really won't lead to true freedom, won't lead to true solutions. And this is why I think this discussion about the rights of the Palestinian refugees and what exactly is happening with the refugee crisis in Palestine and what has been happening over the last few decades, it's so important that we talk about. I am the product of a generation that I think has been pretty indoctrinated with misinformation, that we don't even really truly understand, most of us, how the situation got to be what it is today. And because of that, we've bought into the rhetoric, we've bought into the mantras of one side or the other, and in our desire to make the world a better place have sometimes picked up a cause, picked up a flag based on misinformation. And I hope that this event, one of the reasons I really wanted to be a part of it was because I felt like perhaps it would bring some course correction in a way that can lead to true, lasting liberation for the Palestinian people. I wrote a few notes here, so I'm going to dive into them right now, maybe veer off a little bit. I'm a communicator by profession, and so if I'm not careful, I can go longer instead of shorter, and my notes will help me here. My personal desire to dig deeper for accurate information regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was really reinforced by a defining moment that I had in 2009. After myself and a group of Canadian friends who had traveled to Israel, and we had actually gone into the West Bank, we had visited, a young man who had been bombed. He had opened up a gift, and actually Kalev represented this young man, I believe, in the court system as well. He can maybe, you can read about that online if you're interested in more of that. But we ventured into the West Bank, into the Gaza, spoke with pastors who had had their churches bombed over a dozen times, worked with the Palestinians, worked with the Israelis, and went into Israel with really wide open hearts, just wanting to make the world a better place, And we sat down, we had the opportunity to sit down with a phenomenal journalist. If you Google him, tons of stuff will come up right away. His name was Khalid, I think I'm hopefully saying that right, Khalid Abu Tomei. He's actually been writing on Palestinian affairs for over 3 decades. We sat with Khalid at a hotel which had been bombed just a few years earlier by terrorists, and he began to share insightfully, really insightfully with us regarding the realities of being a professional journalist. He's often published in the Jerusalem Post, and also an Arab living in an Arab city just right outside of Jerusalem. And he would often write as an Arab pro-Israel perspectives. Not because he was inherently pro-Israel, but really just, frankly, because he had seen too much. He told us a few things. There were a few striking points that I took away from that conversation in 2009. Number one, he told us that most Arabs actually prefer the standard of living and the human rights protections that they receive under the Israeli government much more than the rulership and the governance that they get from their own Palestinian leaders. And he told me that he was one of them. He said he much preferred the human rights and the treatment that he received as an Arab journalist in Jerusalem. And that really shocked us, you know, because in the Western media and on our campuses, you know, we sort of had this mindset that most of the Arabs, you know, felt like the Israelis were the oppressors and that the Israeli government were the oppressors and that they had no freedom. And yet this Arab journalist, very well-educated individual, was standing there giving us tangible evidence and not only saying that he preferred to live in a community that was run by Israeli, but he said actually most Arabs felt the same way. The second thing that he said to us, and this really, really, you know, shook me mentally, he said that one of the greatest hindrances to peace in that area of the Middle East was actually the skirmishes between the Hamas and the Fatah themselves. He said that the Hamas in the Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank actually hated each other. We had no idea. He said that there was deep enmity between, and I was actually shocked that I had no idea. You know, I felt like I was a pretty well-informed Canadian activist, and he was telling me things that were so obvious to him in his everyday reality, but I had no idea. He said there was deep enmity between these two ruling bodies, and he actually said, if the international community actually bites the peace plan to divide Jerusalem and create a contiguous state between Gaza and the West Bank, they will basically be uniting two groups of Arabs that hate each other. And he told us, he said this could very well trigger a civil war, and the Palestinian refugees would actually be in a worse scenario then than they are now because they would be in the midst of civil war. And so he stood there and he said, for the sake of the safety of the Palestinians themselves, as an Arab living in the land, he was insisting that a contiguous Palestinian state was actually not a good idea. Not only was he insisting this, but he was asking that we as young Canadians would take this back to our campuses, take this back to our nation, and begin to speak into this issue. Number three, he said that, okay, this one really shook me up a bit. He said that he was concerned that Westerners allowed such mass international funding of the Palestinians when some of this funding was used to produce hate literature towards the West itself in the education of Palestinian children. It was like he looked at us without embellishment. It was like he was saying, and perhaps he was, what is wrong with you Westerners? Don't you realize that you are giving millions of dollars of funding into something that is fueling hatred against you? Number four, he then went on to share with us that within Jerusalem, Arabs and Jews actually live in relative peace. And he said this, currently, you know, I feel more safe as an Arab in Jerusalem than on a Canadian university campus. He had just experienced a very negative situation where he had been speaking to a group and had actually had to have been escorted by security. And he said, I don't know what is up with what's happening on your campuses, but he said, I actually feel safer walking through the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem than I do walking on your campuses after I share my views. He said that this was because he found that when he spoke of the corruption of the Palestinian regime and the state of his own people to a Western audience, there was such an intense inflammatory bias against the truth he was speaking. And he was often met with hostile response, even though he himself was an Arab. The last thing that we were challenged with on that trip didn't actually come from Khalid, but came from an IDF soldier. And he used this analogy. He said, let's talk about your own nation of Canada. If Detroit was bombing Windsor 3 to 12 times a day, and the Canadian government just stood back and did nothing about it, how would you as Canadians respond? And I said, well, you know, we would be upset. You know, we would be petitioning our government. We would be saying, you know, listen, what do we pay you for? We pay you to protect Canadians, you know, to to administrate our army. And he said exactly, this IDF soldier. He said, yet Israel has to sit here on our hands every day and take bombing into our villages, into our communities, because if we rise up and defend ourselves, we will be labeled by the international community as the aggressors. And yet every day, bombs are being shot into our neighborhoods. This to me was a real eye-opener. All of these points proved to me several things. Number one, they proved to me that things are not quite as simple as they may seem. Not quite as, you can't just throw the rhetoric out there, polarized to one side, and just come into alignment with all of the assumptions that the Israelis are the aggressors, are the dominators. Number two, that the Western world has an incomplete picture of what's actually happening in the Middle East, and I had to say that I was one of those people. What was really blocking a true peace plan and reconciliation towards the Palestinians was not necessarily hitting our proverbial eardrums. Number three, I realized that as Canadians, we need to be questioning the funding that we're giving into this situation and what exactly it's being used for. And number four, that we have work to do in getting informed ourselves and informing our leaders. As Canadians, if you are one, we have the awesome privilege of living in something called a democracy. The word democracy comes from two root words which mean people and rulership. It actually means literally that the people rule. In Canada, our government officials are set in place to represent us. They are supposed to be our voice on these issues. And we have the privilege of being change agents not only for our future, but for the international community as well. I was very intrigued in 2010 after one of our cabinet ministers, the Treasury Minister at the time, Vic Taves, announced that Canada would be redirecting funding away from UNRWA to specific projects in Palestine that reflected Canadian values. Read between the lines. Whatever he saw on that trip that our money was going to was not reflecting Canadian values. The previous year we had given $20 million to UNRWA. Simply being exposed to truth, because he was exposed to truth, he was evidently empowered to make a powerful decision that redirected our tax dollars. We need to ensure that our leaders are informed and continue to make powerful decisions. I also want to say that as Canadians, I don't think we always realize how easy it is to change things, how easy it is to access our leaders and to be a voice for change. We have an incredible gift, and it's called the power to change through our voice. We started out as an organization with less than a dozen young adults. That was probably 7 or 8 years ago now. We have now grown into many thousands of us that are a part of the movement and have had over 1,000 sit-down meetings with members of parliament and senators. You're looking at a girl who's the daughter of a professional NHL hockey player. My dad played for the Jets, the Flames, the Capitals. I thought the Senators were a hockey team, okay, for real. And yet when I began to wake up and smell the coffee, so to speak, I began to realize that if I simply knock on their door and I simply bring my voice to the table, not only will they let me in, but they will be thankful that I came, and they will listen to what I have to say. They keep asking us every year we come to come back, and many of our members of parliament have said that the young people who share their voice and give them information on important issues like what we're discussing tonight are the highlight of their year. We're more powerful than we know. Take the time to meet with your elected official and share the information that you've received tonight. I believe it's something else that we can do as responsible Canadians is share that video that we saw at the beginning of the night, and if you came in a little bit late, we encourage you to check it out on the jij.org.il website. That video, I believe, was posted less than 2 weeks ago, and is probably up to almost 34,000 hits. That's a small city. And the reason that it's going viral is because the information is important information that, by and large, hasn't been shared. And we, as Canadians who care, who truly care about the Palestinians and their plight, as we share that video, we can make a change. I want to encourage you, people in the room, those of you that are students, I know not all of us are here tonight, but those of you that are, let's continue to host events like this. Truth is such a powerful thing. And if we want to see a true and lasting remedy to the situation facing our Palestinian brothers and sisters that have been chained and are in bondage to poverty and a system that simply won't let them go, then we need to start sharing the truth that we have heard tonight. I said it already, I'll say it again. As Canadians, we have a powerful gift in this thing called democracy, and that's the power of our voice. And we can be change agents by simply passing this information on. We need to support organizations like JIJ. I found actually a woman just recently named Karen Dunham who personally goes in and serves the Palestinians in the refugee camps. $5 in her pocket will go a lot further than $5 in the hands of UNRWA. And so we need to do our research and start supporting people who are truly helping the Palestinians on the ground. I believe that we're all good-willed, whatever side that we're on. But I guess I'd like to close with the thought that I began with, and that's this. You can have really, really great intentions, but if your intentions and your motivation and what you are shouting about, cheering on, and working towards is based on faulty information, is based on rhetoric, is faulty, then it isn't going to lead to true and lasting change. And that's what we want to be about. This truly is a human rights event for our Palestinian brothers and sisters, and let's take this information and use it powerfully to make a change.
Excellent. Thank you.